My name is Ashton Phelps. I'm the president of Rochester Christie. Whether you're here as a student, faculty member, or just as a curious seeker, we're glad you joined us for this thought-provoking gathering. Rochester Christie, Latin for the reason of Christ, is a movement that engages university students and faculty in meaningful conversations about the intellectual and historical foundations of Christianity. We aim to foster a space where difficult questions are welcomed, rigorous discussions are encouraged, and truth is pursued with both the heart and the mind. Tonight, an exciting topic is in store. Our speaker, Dr. Rana, got his PhD in biochemistry and works for an organization called Reasons to Believe, based out of California. He's also an avid comic book collector. He will be talking about who are we, a scientific case for the image of God in the age of AI. We hope this will help you dig deep. We hope this will help you dig deep in questions regarding identity. Thank you for being here. Be sure to stick around for the Q&A. Don't hesitate to connect with us to learn more about our weekly meetings and future events. Without further ado, welcome Dr. Rana.
Well, good evening. I'm just curious as we get started tonight, how many of you like to eat at Taco Bell? What? It's a surprising number. Okay, how many of you like to eat at Taco Bell but you never in your wildest dreams would raise your hand in public admitting to anybody that you like to eat at Taco Bell? Right, well, I'm not a huge Taco Bell fan, but there's one item on their menu that I like. It's the Mexican pizza, right? And when my wife and I travel, which is quite a bit because we have kids and grandkids all over the country, I travel for Reasons to Believe, and my wife will come with me many times. We're often gone from our house for a week or so, which means that we've cleaned out the refrigerator before we left. So when we come back home, a lot of times it's late at night, we're hungry, there's nothing in the house really to eat. So it's like, well, what do you want to do? Well, let's go to Taco Bell and get Mexican pizza. So as soon as I land at the airport and get my bag and get into my ride on my way home, I start to think, wow, in a few minutes I'm going to be able to get a Mexican pizza. And it's for that reason that I was actually fascinated several months ago now when I read an article that Taco Bell is looking to use AI to take drive-through orders, right? And the idea would be that you, as a customer, you pull up to the window and your order would be taken by an AI system, not by a human being. And Taco Bell thinks that this is actually going to improve the overall customer experience. The orders are going to be more accurate. The AI actually does a better job of upselling than human beings do. And the orders are going to be more accurate, just overall better customer service. And so in the near future, when you go to Taco Bell or probably other fast food restaurants, it's quite likely that you're not going to be able to tell whether you're interacting with an AI or with a human being when you place your order, when you place your fast food order. And technically, when that happens, basically the AI that's powering drive-through windows will have passed the Turing test, right? This is a test developed by Alan Turing, who many people consider to be the father of modern computer science. And Turing's idea was that a machine and a human would be considered indistinguishable if your interactions with the machine and a computer are the same, where you can't tell the difference as to whether you're interacting with a machine or with a human being on the other side of that machine. So when you think about it, ChatGPT, the AI that powers customer service on websites, these are all satisfying the Turing test, which means in our language today that according to the Turing test, you would have to consider those AI systems to be persons. Now, there's a lot of problems with the Turing test, and I'm not going to get into them, but this is provocative because it really begins to raise questions about who are we as human beings in a world that AI is beginning to assume increasingly the characteristics of human beings to the point that our interaction with an AI system and a human being is indistinguishable when we pull into a drive-through window. In 2016, which is now almost 9 years ago, there was a foresight conference held in Saudi Arabia. And to introduce the conference, a dignitary from Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to an AI-powered robotic system named Sophia. Maybe some of you are familiar with Sophia. And of course, this is ironic, but I'm not going to get into that given the position that the Saudi government holds on women's rights. But Sophia is, again, an AI-powered robotic system that is being designed by Hanson Robotics, headquartered in Hong Kong. And the idea behind Sophia is to create a robotic system such that the user forms an emotional bond with Sophia. And the reason why Hanson Robotics wants to do this is because in certain parts of the world, particularly in Asia, as the birth rate drops, elderly people have really no family members. And they oftentimes will live by themselves, isolated in their apartment or in their home without any kind of human contact for weeks and weeks on end. And this impacts mental health, it impacts physical health. So the idea is that if you could build a robotic system such that the user forms an emotional bond with that system, it could improve the mental health and the physical well-being of elderly people and people that are just isolated from human contact. And again, these kind of advances really raise the question, who are we as human beings? And this question is particularly poignant for people who hold to a Judeo-Christian worldview, which argues that human beings are made in God's image. And part of this idea is that human beings are unique, that we're exceptional, that we stand apart from all other creatures, right? That there's something fundamentally distinct and special about human beings. And the idea here is that if AI systems are becoming increasingly just like us to the point where people are contemplating granting personhood and even quote-unquote human rights to AI systems, then what does it mean about us as human beings, particularly again from a Christian worldview perspective? Are we truly unique? Are we truly exceptional? And all of this that's happening with AI is in a context, right? It's in a particular context. And that context has been largely shaped by the evolutionary paradigm, right? That according to the evolutionary paradigm, human beings are essentially glorified animals, that we really are not fundamentally different than any other life form on the planet. We only differ in degree, not kind, from every other creature. And of course, this idea was advanced by Charles Darwin in his book, The Descent of Man. Interestingly enough, in The Origin of Species, where Darwin presents his theory of evolution, he's very careful not to mention the question of human origins. But a little bit over a decade later, in his book, The Descent of Man, he takes on the question of human origins head on, where he argues that human beings, like all other life forms on the planet, are the product of an evolutionary history. And according to that view, there really is nothing exceptional or unique about human beings. That this perspective challenges in a fundamental way the idea of the image of God. That everything we think that is special about us, according to Darwin, is the product of evolutionary forces, not the handiwork of a creator. That the things that we think that make us unique and exceptional already exist in animals, just to a lesser degree. And that there is a gradual process by which we become humans. Darwin writes in the descent of man, these famous words, maybe you have heard this quote before, in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. The difference in mind between man and higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree, not kind. And so here we see with this idea, which has literally shaped the question of human origins from a scientific perspective over the last 170 years. This idea has literally become part of our culture, right? That we are the product of evolution. And if that is really the case, there's nothing special about us. So these advances that are happening in AI are happening in a context where we already recognize that maybe there's nothing really special about us as human beings, which means, could it be possible that if we create a system, an AI system, that is complex enough, it literally will be like us in every sense of the word? Now, this idea of human evolution, again, has set the stage to undermine the notion of the image of God. And so has work that's happened in recent years in which many anthropologists believe that we need to rehabilitate our view of Neanderthals. That we need to think of Neanderthals not as these intellectually inferior, cognitively inferior brutes, but that they were just like us in many ways. And so it's not uncommon now to read in the popular science news about discoveries in which Neanderthals claim to have been making art, making jewelry, making music, possessing language, burying their dead ritually, or mastering fire, and the list goes on and on. That is, again, the idea was that, at least with respect to the hominins, humans, modern humans stood apart even from Neanderthals, and now there are anthropologists who are arguing this isn't the case whatsoever. This is a little bit of a dated quote, but it really drives home the point, I think, quite well. This is by Via and Robrooks in an article published in PLOS 1. They say modern humans are usually seen as superior in a wide range of domains, including weaponry and subsistence strategies, which would have led to the demise of Neanderthals. This systematic review of the archaeological records of Neanderthals and their modern human contemporaries finds no support for such interpretations, as the Neanderthal archaeological record is not different enough to explain the demise in terms of inferiority in archaeologically visible domains. In other words, the archaeological record seems to indicate Neanderthals were just like us. There are other advances that are happening as well in other areas of science that, again, raise questions about who we are as human beings and challenge the notion of the image of God. For example, we now understand animals to be far more intelligent than we appreciated. That they actually lead emotionally rich and meaningful lives. That they have a culture that is cumulative. That means that it is a sets of behaviors that are unique to a particular group. And that those behaviors are passed on from generation to generation. And over time, that there are aspects of that culture that grow or added to. That's referred to as cumulative culture. So, for example, whales, and by the way, I generated this image using AI, so just for fun. But for example, whales have songs, right? And they have these very elaborate songs that they will actually perform for up to 30 minutes. And each pod of whales has a unique song. And when pods encounter each other, they'll sing to each other. And as a result of that, those interactions, each of those pods will redevelop the song. And so this is an example of cumulative culture. culture that is inherited, again, from generation to generation, that is able to change. Nathan Lentz, in his book Not So Different, writes, all the impressive human cognitive abilities evolved in ancestor species that already had an extensive palette of emotional states. In order to understand how our ancestors made the jump from animal behavior to human psychology, we must first recognize that the distance of that evolutionary jump is not as great as it seems. So the question here is, who are we as human beings? And is it possible in this scientific age that is characterized really by advances in AI technology, is it possible to hold to a view that says human beings are exceptional, that human beings are unique, that human beings bear God's image and stand apart from all other creatures? Is this actually possible? And what I'm going to argue in the remaining time that I have is that when we press into the scientific evidence centered around the origin of humanity, the nature of animal behavior, even the nature of AI, that what we actually see is that a very strong scientific case for human exceptionalism emerges, and that we can link the case scientifically for human exceptionalism to the image of God. Now, the first thing that I need to do is define some terms. Specifically, what do I mean when I use the term human? And the reason why I need to define this is because scientifically, this term is ambiguous. This term is ambiguous. It can refer to the hominins, which would mean groups of species like the Australopithecines, or the hominins, or the erectines, or the archaic Homo sapiens. All of these would be considered to be humans. Sometimes the term is used to refer to members of the Homo genus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals. Sometimes it refers to Homo sapiens, which would include archaic Homo sapiens, creatures like Neanderthals, as well as Homo sapiens sapiens, which would be modern humans. And sometimes it's referring to only modern humans. So this is an ambiguous term scientifically. Theologically, the idea of human would refer to anyone who bears God's image. And there is a debate right now among Christian scholars as to who or what bears God's image. And so scientifically, when I'm using the term human, I'm referring to modern humans. That's what I mean, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens. When I'm using the term human in a theological context, I'm also referring to anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. I would argue that when Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 accounts were received by the original audience, they would have had, it was a pre-scientific age, they would have had no idea about hominins. And so they understood humanity, they understood humanity to be like them, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. Okay, so with that cleared up, now the question is, are we different in degree or kind? That really is the fundamental question as we look to see, can we preserve the image of God in a scientific age? And even though this idea that humans differ in degree, not kind, has shaped anthropology for the last 170 years, remarkably, there's a growing number of anthropologists who question whether or not this is true, who challenge the standard evolutionary view, who raise the point, based on the data, that actually human beings stand apart from all other creatures, that actually human beings are fundamentally different. We differ in kind, not degree. And one of those scientists is Thomas Suddendorf. In 2015, so this book is about 10 years old, Suddendorf argued in his book, The Gap, that human beings are fundamentally different in kind, not different in degree. And this is what he writes in the book. We reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history, and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forest. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds. Now, this is a radical statement in anthropology. You may not appreciate how radical it is, but this is a radical statement. Because in the evolutionary framework, humans and chimps share a common ancestor. And that this ancestral group gave rise about 6 to 7 million years ago to two diverging lineages, one culminating in modern humans and one culminating in chimpanzees and bonobos. And Suddendorf's point is, chimpanzees and bonobos are on the verge of extinction. Humans have put people on the moon. And the question is, why? Why are there two very different evolutionary outcomes? And his argument is there has to be something fundamentally different about humans and chimpanzees in order to explain that different evolutionary outcome. And he argues that this is what makes us unique. That difference is what makes us different in kind. Suddendorf just recently published another book called The Invention of Tomorrow. In this book, he argues that human beings are the only species that are able to invent the future. Now, that may seem odd, but here's his argument. That as human beings, we have this ability to mental time travel. We do it so effortlessly that you probably aren't even aware that you're doing it. But every human being constantly, incessantly mental time travels. We travel back to the past. Not only just something that happened earlier today, but things that happened years ago. And we remember what happened, and we reflect upon what was the sequence of events that led to that outcome. And if we made different decisions, would there have been a different outcome? And from that point in time, what were the decisions that we made that led us to this point in time? And if we made different decisions, how would those outcomes be different? Right? This is called a counterfactual analysis. We do this all the time, and because we understand cause and effect, we can actually learn from what didn't happen in the past. We can learn from what didn't happen in the past. Likewise, we can actually project into the future, not just what's going to happen later this evening, but years into the future. And then we can work our way backward in terms of what types of decisions would we need to make today in order to create that future. And we can imagine multiple alternate futures where there are different pathways to each of those futures, and we can now set goals that we achieve that lead us to the future of our desire. We literally can invent tomorrow. This capacity for mental time travel, which allows us to problem solve, is fundamentally distinct and unique to humans. And is part of why Suddendorf believes we're different in kind. He says this: there is no compelling evidence that non-human species generate or communicate mental scenarios of remote future events, connect them into narratives, or reason about mutually exclusive versions of the future. Only humans appear capable of such feats. So, Suddendorf and other anthropologists like him have tried to codify what is it that makes us unique as human beings. And they argue that there are 4 qualities. That we have the ability to represent the world with symbols. Right? So not only can we represent concrete aspects of the world with symbols, we can represent abstract ideas with symbols. And then we can recombine those symbols in a near infinite number of ways. This is the basis for language. This is the basis for music, for art, for body ornamentation. Right? Then we also have theory of mind. where we recognize that other people have minds like ours, and we anticipate what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and we want to connect our minds together. We want to collaborate with each other, and we do this through the construction of complex social hierarchical structures. And it's this suite of 4 properties that makes us unique as human beings. Now, in other words, there is good reasons to think that human beings are exceptional, right? And these are some of those qualities that cause us to be different in kind. I see these qualities as scientific descriptors of what I, as a Christian, understand to be the image of God, right? If you take a particular view of the image of God known as the substantive view or the resemblance view, that where you see the image of God as reflecting certain qualities that human beings uniquely possess, you could argue that what these scientists have stumbled upon in their case for human exceptionalism is essentially a scientific case for the image of God. Now, what's interesting to me and deeply gratifying is that there's other scientific data that affirms the notion of human exceptionalism. For example, the human anatomical, the anatomy of the human skull and face is unique among all the hominins. That we have a globular skull. Our skull is shaped like a globe. Our face is flat. Our chin is retracted. This is in distinction to Neanderthals. Neanderthals actually had a brain size larger than the human brain. The brain size to body mass ratio was slightly smaller, but the brain was actually larger. But the brain shape is different in Neanderthals than in modern humans. Their skull is elongated. Their face it juts out. The chin juts out. And this leads to a fundamentally different brain shape between humans and Neanderthals. And in fact, people have done studies where they have looked at the brain shape of other hominins like Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus and have shown that erectus and heidelbergensis had a brain shape similar to Neanderthals. The only difference was their brains were, on average, smaller. And here are humans who have a distinct brain shape. And this brain shape, which involves an expanded parietal lobe and temporal lobe, is a deep consequence because it allows us to carry out activities that essentially render us with the capability of symbolism and open generative ability to manipulate those symbols. And in other words, Neanderthals didn't have a brain that supported symbolism. In addition to that, when we look at the fossil record, it appears as if this globular skull shape and flat face and retracted chin show up at about 130,000 years ago. This is when it looks as if modern humans, at least anatomically, appear. What's interesting to me is that there's been recent work that indicates that evidence for symbolism in the archaeological record shows up at about this time. And there's a series of discoveries that point to the origin of symbolism coincidentally to the origin of the unique globular skull of modern humans. For example, in recent years, anthropologists and archaeologists have discovered cave art in Southeast Asia. So there's a number of cave sites now that actually display cave art, and this art is actually older than the cave art in Europe, but it's of the same quality and the same types of depictions. And so what we see is art appears in Southeast Asia and in Europe more or less at the same time. In the neighborhood of about 40,000 years ago, the cave art in Southeast Asia is slightly older, which means that when humans began to migrate around the world, they had this capacity for artistic expression and hence symbolism already before they left Africa. Christopher Stringer writes this: "It's a really important find. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a created explosion that was special to Europe. It did not develop in other parts of the world until much later. The basis for this art was there 60,000 years ago. It may have even been there in Africa before 60,000 years ago, and it spread with modern humans." And we also have evidence in the caves of coastal South Africa of symbolism that dates somewhere between 50 and 80,000 years ago. There's an interesting study done by a paleolinguist at MIT named Neanderthals. And what he argues is that the art produced by the sand, a people group that was found in Africa, is qualitatively the same as the art produced in the caves in Europe and Southeast Asia. This art dates at about 70,000 years ago. And he points out that from a genetic standpoint, the sand are one of the first groups to break away from, or to diverge from the main modern human trunk. And he argues that a genetic analysis indicates this happened somewhere between 110 and 160,000 years ago, and he argues that art would have had to have existed prior to that point of separation. More recently, Neanderthals has published another paper where he argues that this point of departure is about 135,000 years ago. So he's revising the date, but he argues that this is also the time where you can make an argument that language appears. Not only art, but language. Why would he say that? Because there's 7,000 languages around the world, and they all have common core characteristics. And he argues that those core characteristics must have already existed before the sand and the rest of humanity diverge as two separate lines. And he argues that, again, this would have been 135,000 years ago. So it's interesting that we see the origin of the globular human skull, which is unique, and the origin of symbolism at the same time in the fossil and archaeological records, and that this globular skull shape explains our capacity for symbolism, open-ended generative abilities, as well as our theory of mind and our social hierarchical structure. In other words, that we see all the data from these different areas converging into a singular story that says human beings appear to be unique and exceptional, we appear to be distinct. So now, what about Neanderthals? Well, because again, the claim is that Neanderthals were just like us. Well, even though if you pick up a popular science article, it's almost invariably going to say Neanderthals were just like us, when you actually get into the scientific literature, every one of these capabilities that are claimed for Neanderthals are disputed. For every study that claims Neanderthals made art, there are studies that claim Neanderthals didn't make art. Right? And we could spend hours going through the scientific literature looking at this debate. What we can say from the scientific literature is that nobody knows what Neanderthals' capabilities would have been. It is a debated issue. It's not settled by any means. And for me, what seals the deal from the archaeological record is this. It's the trajectory of technology. Neanderthals are on Earth longer than humans have been on Earth, modern humans. And their technology remains static throughout the duration of their existence. Humans appeared on Earth 130,000 years ago employing primitive technology, and in a relatively short period of time, we've put human beings on the moon, right? There has to be something that separates us, distinguishes us from Neanderthals, and it is most likely our capacity for symbolism. Johann Bolhuis, as well as Noam Chomsky and Ian Tattersall in an article like this: our species was born in a technologically archaic context. And significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinctive species, but it was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. This stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then, within a remarkably short period of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people reached the moon. So, Neanderthals are not like us. This is really what the scientific data is telling us. And there's other studies I can discuss that provide even further support for that idea. Okay, well, what about animal intelligence? Right? Are animals only just a little bit different from us? Or is there a fundamental difference? Well, even though, again, we've seen remarkable behavior in animals that we didn't fully appreciate, there is an animal behavioralist named Johan Lind from Sweden who has argued that animals are solving problems, are displaying emotional capabilities, are developing and exchanging culture in fundamentally different ways than we are as human beings. And he argues that when you look at AI systems, which are based on machine learning, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, AI systems can solve some pretty incredible problems. AI systems have these incredible capabilities, but AI systems are fundamentally operating through associative learning. Right? This is the Pavlovian response, right? That if you do a certain behavior that people want, you get a reward. If you engage in a behavior that people don't want, you get punished. And so the idea here is that through reward and punishment, you can, again, you learn behaviors. And essentially, machine learning is associative learning. If there's a particular outcome from an AI system and you want that outcome, you give it a thumbs up or you give it a high score. If it's an outcome you don't want, you give it a thumbs down or a negative score. Right? And that's essentially reward and punishment, respectively. Right? And he argues that if AI systems have this capability through machine learning, through associative learning, maybe the same thing can be true for animals. And he actually developed a computer program that simulated different animal behavior studies that showed animals displaying this incredible problem-solving ability. And what he showed is he could simulate the results of experimental work through this computer program using only associative learning. And one of the things that animals have is short-term memory, which means that they can actually daisy-chain together behaviors. It will repeat those behaviors in order to get a reward, and that actually constitutes sophisticated problem solving on their part. But what they're doing is engaging in associative learning. They're not engaging in mental time travel and abstract reasoning like human beings are. Johan Lind writes, associative learning is an underestimated general mechanism that can account for a large array of behavioral phenomena observed in animals. Just recently, there was a paper published looking at the uniqueness of human culture and pointing out that while we now recognize that some animals, like whales, dolphins, corvids, the great apes, have cumulative culture, that what distinguishes animal culture from modern human culture is that modern human culture displays an open-endedness to it. So it's going back to this open-ended generative capacity where we treat cultural elements in the same way we treat elements in language or symbols, where we can combine them and recombine them. This is what they like. The most distinctive feature of human culture is its comparatively open-ended capacity. Only human culture is able to expand to explore new phenomena. Human culture is enhanced by recombination. So in other words, we stand apart as human beings, even from animals, even though what they're doing is remarkable, that they we are not different in degree, we are different in kind from animals. Something else that we need to keep in mind, and that's the danger of anthropomorphism. In marrying Sam Dawkins, Richard Dawkins' first wife, who is an animal behavioralist, and wrote a book, Why Animals Matter, where she was arguing for animal rights. And in this book, she points out, in a critical way towards work being done in animal behavioral studies, that oftentimes the researchers are anthropomorphizing. They see results from these studies, and they begin to attribute human motives and human qualities and capabilities to animals that actually don't exist. And this is fundamentally the basis for, this is fundamentally arising out of our theory of mind. Because we have theory of mind, and again, we recognize that others have minds like ours, we know what they're thinking, we know what they're feeling. When we interact with animals and they do certain behaviors, we attribute human motives to them. We anthropomorphize. We attribute human qualities to them and human capabilities to them, when in fact what they're doing is fundamentally different than what we are doing. And this anthropomorphism is something that even sophisticated scientists can be victimized by, right? They can be victimized by that. Sudendorf, in The Gap, writes this, that animals may be able to communicate, but humans have open-ended generative capacity. And animal communication is not just simply a stepping stone to open-ended generative capacity. According to Sudendorf, they're fundamentally different and distinct capabilities, which makes us different in kind. Animals have memory, we have mental time travel, animals have social cognition, we have theory of mind, animals solve problems, we engage in abstract reasoning, animals have social traditions, we have actually open-ended generative culture, animals have empathy, we have morality. Nathan Lentz, in his book Not So Different, writes this: I think both humans and chimpanzees feel love. The only difference is that humans write sonnets about it. That's a big difference. It reflects the capacity for symbolism that animals don't have. So yes, indeed, animals, chimpanzees, have emotionally rich lives. Maybe they actually feel something that we would understand as love, right? But they're not able to express it in the way that we are able to express it, because they lack symbolic capabilities, which means we're different in kind, not different in degree. Humans and dolphins practice fair play, but only humans enact laws to govern it. A capacity for symbolism. Humans and elephants experience grief, but only humans seek professional counseling to cope with it. We really are different in kind. And let's bring this all now full circle. What about AI systems, right? Well, it was interesting because today we sat at a table in the center of campus, and people walked by and we asked them a question: will AI systems ever be like us? Will they ever be persons? And most people said no, right? Most people recognize that AI systems aren't really ever going to be like us. They're very powerful, computer tools. They're going to mimic humans in many respects, but they're never going to be like us. Because again, what AI systems are doing are employing associative learning or machine learning, and they are designed to mimic human beings in terms of our responses, in terms of our emotions. And they're going to get better and better at doing this, but they're not going to be like us. Just for fun, I asked Gemini, which is Google's AI tool, could AI systems ever be like human beings? And this is what an AI system told me. While AI can generate content, it struggles with true creativity and original thought. Machines cannot innovate, envision abstract concepts, or produce truly novel ideas that go beyond the patterns present in their training data. Creative thinking remains a distinctly human trait. So we are really different in kind. But again, this idea of anthropomorphism is really important here. Because if there is an AI system that mimics our responses almost to perfection, that mimics human emotions almost to perfection, what are we going to do? We're going to attribute human motives to it. We're going to attribute human qualities to it. We're going to think that it's a person like us. So the irony here is that this quality called theory of mind, which is part of the reason why we are different in kind from other creatures, actually causes us to think that other creatures are like us. Animals or other entities like AI systems are like us. That's the irony. That which makes us unique causes us to think that we're not that different. We're not so different. So the bottom line is, what I've argued tonight is that in this age of AI, a world that's shaped by the evolutionary paradigm that argues that humans really are not unique and exceptionalism, that in this scientific age, it is possible to make a scientific case that human beings are exceptional, that we're unique, and that we can connect that case for human exceptionalism to the image of God. That is, we can defend this critical biblical idea of the image of God from a scientific perspective. And this is not trivial, because the image of God is the foundation of Christian ethics. Because every human being bears God's image. Every human life has infinite worth and value. Because of the image of God, we can enter into a relationship with the Godhead, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, mediated through the work of Christ on the cross. This is crazy to think that the God who brought the universe into existence is a God that we can enter into a relationship with because we bear God's image. And the image of God is what made the incarnation possible. It's what made it possible for Jesus, the second member of the Trinity, to take on the form of a human being, to live among us a life that was sinless, and then to sacrifice himself willingly on the cross that we can be reconciled to God. So this idea of the image of God is central to Christian theology, it's central to the gospel, and it is an idea that withstands the rigors of scientific evaluation. I'm going to go into a time of Q&A, but just as a way to say thank you to you guys for inviting us to be here with you, we have a gift for you. If you take out your phone and you scan this QR code, it'll take you to a place where you can fill out some contact information, your name and email, and what we will do is send you a PDF, or is that what we're sending, a PDF of an ebook that demonstrates the harmony between science and the Christian faith. So that's a gift for you for just being here tonight and for the invitation to be here with you. So while you're doing that, I'm happy to take any questions. So I guess you can just raise your hand and shout out your question. I'll try my best to hear you. My hearing isn't what it used to be. I listened to a lot of rock and roll in my younger days, and even as I grew into an adult. And so as a result of that, my hearing isn't as good as it used to be, but it was completely worth it. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, but I'll just do one. So, kind of on our technical detail, on the Neanderthals and modern humans discussion, we hear a lot, especially in biology, about interbreeding.
Yes.
Oh, hey, here we go. We hear a lot about the interbreeding or shared genetics of human Neanderthals. So you highlight a lot of the differences between the two. I guess my question, without maybe giving the answer to what I think, but are you referring to more a point in time when humans and Neanderthals existed, or I guess how would you, how do you, I guess, reconcile that?
Okay, that's a great question. And so it's going to take me a bit of time to unpack this. So if you just bear with me, I'll try not to do another lecture. But just so you understand my perspective, I hold a position that is referred to as old Earth creationism. So I see Genesis 1 as a real historical description of God's creative work, but I see day as a period of time, not 24 hours. So I have no issue with the antiquity of the earth, the antiquity of life on earth, in light of Genesis 1. In fact, I think there's a remarkable congruence between the Genesis 1 account and the scientific record. I also take the view that human beings were created through God's direct intervention in a personal way, made in his image, and that Adam and Eve were the first human beings, and they were and that they gave rise to all humanity. All humanity comes from Adam and Eve. So that's the perspective I hold. And as a creationist, I am skeptical about certain aspects of the evolutionary paradigm. I'm not sure that with current evolutionary theory, you can account for the totality of life's history. I think there are clearly places where God would have had to intervene. So that's my viewpoint. How do I make sense of the hominins? Well, I see the hominins as creatures that existed, that had intelligence, that had emotional capabilities. I see them as cognitively inferior to modern humans, but they still had a culture, they had technology. They lack the image of God. I do not see them as image bearers. So I would see them in the same vein as I would see the great apes. Fascinating, remarkable creatures, intelligent, emotionally rich, but there's something obviously different between a human being and a chimpanzee. I think if we interact with Neanderthals, that would be our experience as well, is that these are not like us. Now, what about the question of interbreeding? That's a great question because, well, if they're able to, if humans and Neanderthals can interbreed, would that mean that Neanderthals really were the same as human beings? And this is related to the biological species concept. And there's other concepts for species that we could employ, but in the biological species concept, a species is an interbreeding population that's able to produce viable offspring. The problem is that we know of countless examples in the animal world of species that will interbreed and produce viable offspring. In some instances, those offspring are more fit than the offspring of the individual species. So this idea of hybridization is widespread, or integration is widespread. So for humans and Neanderthals to interbreed is really not surprising in that sense. Now, the question oftentimes is, if that interbreeding happened, would the offspring have the image of God? Would the offspring have a soul? And my answer, and this is a response that I've seen other theologians give, like Andrew Loke at Hong Kong Baptist University, is that in a sense, that the image of God is, well, let me take a step back. There are two models for ensoulment among Christian theologians. One's called traducianism, one's called creationism. In creationism, God creates a soul in every embryo. At what point does God do that? Nobody knows, but God is creating the soul. So in the creationist model, you would argue that, look, if one of the parents was human, you could envision God honoring that, giving that hybrid that had at least one human parent a soul. In traducianism, the idea is that the soul is inherited spiritually just like our genetics are inherited physically. But the image of God isn't divisible. It's either there or it's not there. So if even one parent had the image of God, then you would expect that child to have the image of God as well. So I think that interbreeding doesn't really cause any kind of damage to the view that would see humans and Neanderthals as being distinct, right? And there's data, I don't know how robust it is, but there is data that seems to suggest that the human Neanderthal hybrids were just on the cusp of fecundity, meaning they just were were just barely able to reproduce. In fact, there's no evidence for Neanderthal DNA in the Y chromosome, which likely means that the male hybrids didn't survive or they weren't able to reproduce. So it's probably females that were the ones that were able to reproduce as hybrids. And again, I don't know how robust that data is, but those are ideas that I've seen bouncing around in the scientific literature. Something that's very interesting is that there are what are called Neanderthal gene deserts in the human genome. So everybody in here has somewhere between 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. You don't need to go to 23andMe and pay money to do the test to get the results that tell you that you have Neanderthal DNA, because by virtue of the fact that unless you have deep African ancestry, you most likely have Neanderthal DNA. But each of us has distinct Neanderthal DNA sequences in our genome. They're not the same sequences and they're not in the same spots, right? And in fact, taking the totality of the human population, you can literally reconstruct somewhere between 40 to 60% of the Neanderthal genome, which is amazing, right? So we have Neanderthal DNA scattered all over our genomes, except there are regions where there's no Neanderthal DNA whatsoever. These are called gene deserts. And it turns out that those gene deserts oftentimes will encode genes that play a role in neural development, right? That are known to play a significant role in neural development. And so the thought is that when Neanderthal DNA was introduced in the human genome in those regions, it was so harmful that either the hybrid didn't survive or natural selection very quickly weeded out those Neanderthal contributions. In fact, people believe that this is actually the species barrier. Is part of the species barrier between humans and Neanderthals are these gene deserts. And it's interesting because these are areas where, again, it's controlling cognitive development, which would actually connect to, the capacity for symbolism and open-ended generative ability. So in other words, there almost seems to be a protective mechanism in place so that those physical qualities that we have that allow for the image of God to be expressed in humans are preserved, even in the human Neanderthal hybrids. So, long answer to your very good question.
Sorry, can I ask one small follow-up on that?
Yeah, sure.
Do we have direct evidence of human Neanderthal hybrids, or is it just the deduction from Neanderthal DNA being, Neanderthal sequences being modern humans?
Yeah, there have been some fossil finds that people have argued are hybrids. I don't know that if there's genetic evidence connected to those fossil finds, but it's probably based on the suite of anatomical features. Those oftentimes are disputed. It's the strength of the argument is primarily genetic. But for example, there's actually modern human fossils that date to close to 40,000 years, where we can carbon date the fossils and get decent ages. And in those fossils, the Neanderthal contribution is much higher. It's in the neighborhood of about 15%. And the Neanderthal sequences are longer, right? And so this is exactly what you would predict if there was interbreeding that happened when humans began to migrate out of Africa, right? And encountered Neanderthals, and nobody knows how many times that interbreeding took place. That's heavily debated, but that's exactly what you would expect. So there's a number of lines of genetic evidence that really cohere well. Anybody else? Yes?
Okay, I have a question. So, Austin, but, okay, so for people who argue that, Homo sapiens sapiens were, evolved from the other species of, Homo sapiens, in that term, what about, if you're arguing for it, what about people who would use evidence of like vestigial structures that are in current like Homo sapiens sapiens, like appendix or wisdom teeth, or there's a muscle, I think it's called like the palmaris longus, like in your forearm, or like goosebumps. Like, how would you argue against that to say that that's not evidence that like humans were evolved?
Yeah. Every example that I've seen of vestigial structures, actually, they turn out not to be vestigial, right? They turn out to be, for example, I've written a podcast or recorded a video on the palmaris muscle, right? And written articles on the wisdom teeth. But let's just use the appendix as an example. I mean, everybody thought that the appendix was, again, a vestigial structure, but when you actually build evolutionary trees, the appearance of the appendix doesn't fit the pattern you would expect if it was a vestigial structure within those evolutionary trees. It just doesn't fit. And it turns out that it does perform a critical function. It's essentially a storehouse for bacteria so that you can repopulate your intestinal tract after it's bouts of diarrhea, right? So it's actually performing a critical role. And the data that I've seen indicates that appendicitis is actually a first world problem, or a problem you see in the developing world. You don't see appendicitis, and the thought is it's related to a greater degree of intestinal distress in other parts of the world. That we live in such hyper-hygiene environments that makes us prone to appendicitis. And the idea that you can take out the appendix and there's no consequences is also being challenged now, where some people think that there's a greater degree of colitis associated with appendectomies. So to argue that it's a vestigial structure is a flawed argument, right? And like with wisdom teeth, what you can show is that the diet that we have, which is prior to the agricultural revolution, humans were hunter-gatherers. After the agricultural revolution, our diet became softer. And as a result of that, that actually influences how the jaw develops. So when you eat a Paleolithic diet, your jaw develops differently. Wisdom teeth fit very comfortably in your jaw. It's just with a different diet, so it's really an environmental effect. And the palmaris muscle, also the goosebumps that we get, these are all not vestigial. They're widely understood as non-vestigial structures. So it's just not an argument against a creation model. But yeah, if you go to our website, reasons.org, and search, or you go to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe, and you put those terms in and search, you can get articles or videos that go into a lot of detail. If that's something that you find interesting, or how you want to spend your precious spare time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Rich. I mentioned it a little bit before. I'm a software engineer right now, and I'm interested in AI, and I've taken some classes on it. You made an argument during the presentation about how machine learning operates on associative learning, right? You have an input, and you say that's good or that's bad, and it learns based on it. And to me, that sounds like it categorizes a subcategory of machine learning, a very prominent one that like ChatGPT is part of, and a lot of these other ones called supervised learning. There are other types of AI models called unsupervised learning, where you have just the data and no input on whether it's good or bad, and you generate outputs of that. Often different kinds of outputs, but outputs nonetheless. In this talk, when you talk about machine learning, are you talking just about supervised learning? Or if not, in what sense do the unsupervised learning models
Yeah,
have associative traits?
that's a great question. And I would have to think about that. My background is in the life sciences, it's not in computer science. I mean, but you know, in a sense, non-supervised learning has its antecedents in things like principal component analysis and things like that, right? Or cluster analysis, right? It's just a very, it seems to me, naively, like a very sophisticated form of cluster analysis, right? Which is very powerful in terms of extracting data. But it seems to me that what you have is a set algorithm by which the machine is learning. So it may not be technically associative learning, but it's still a fixed algorithm, right? And yeah, but so I don't know that leads to a machine that has creative capacities or the capacity to innovate, right? I mean, there may be somebody here who has more of a background in AI that might like to engage that point. It's a great question. I need to think about this more.
Maybe I'm being off this, but I was thinking that supervised learning is referring to the
I'm sorry, what's that? Oh.
Well, I was thinking that unsupervised learning is just referring to the labeling of the data, not necessarily whether or not the outcomes are good or not. So in other words,
Oh, gosh.
There's no.
right, but I guess I think what his point would be is in associative learning, you're still, the idea is you're still making a decision on whether the outcome was good or not, and then feeding back whether it's a good result or a bad result. So whether it's supervised or unsupervised, I think you're still going to have an output that then you would tell the model was like, yes, that's the correct output, or that's not the correct output, and it would go back and learn again, either supervised or unsupervised, and opponent's model to create an output that was again either what you meant or not, and so on and so forth. I think I can double check on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, because in supervised learning, what you say is, I've got 10 pictures of cats and 10 pictures of dogs, and I'm going to tell the AI system, these are cats, these are dogs. In unsupervised learning, you just say, here are 20 pictures, and the AI system will then cluster them, right? But you're right, what you're doing is you're coming in and saying, did you actually cluster them appropriately, right? Or when you cluster them, now when you then give a picture of that's not part of the training set of a cat or a dog, it doesn't discriminate it. And then, so thanks for that. Great questions.
either way.
With regard to the anthropomorphism that you talked about, is there a way to quantify that if in the analysis that we are observing human traits or that we're not and that we're just pretending that they're there through anthropomorphism? Is there a way that we can evaluate that in the science, if that makes sense?
The people that have made that argument have not made it quantitatively but qualitatively. In science, if you're clever enough, you can quantify anything, right? So the answer to your question is most likely yes. I'm not sure what you would get out of quantifying that. I mean, I think really it's meant to be a point of caution. That when you are working in animal behavioral studies or when you're thinking about what is the AI actually doing, that you have an awareness of your tendency because of theory of mind to mislabel potentially. I mean, you can even argue that this danger of anthropomorphism applies to how we interpret Neanderthal behavior. I've seen anthropologists like Ian Tattersall argue that we want to look at the Neanderthal archaeological record through the lens of being a modern human versus looking at the Neanderthal archaeological record with the idea, what is it telling us about Neanderthals? Let's understand them on their own terms. So there's even that subtle anthropomorphism that makes its way into anthropology when you're looking at the hominin archaeological record of hominin behaviors, right? And in fact, if you look at the hominins and the erectines, what they're doing is comparable to the types of tool usage, for example, that you see chimpanzees engaged, or the tool manufacturing use that you see for chimpanzees. So to me, it's more of just being aware that this is our tendency and just being cautious about immediately drawing conclusions about the likeness of an animal or an AI system to a human, right? So, I mean, I'm just curious, what do you think, what was the basis behind your question? Am I addressing your question at all?
I was just curious, like if there's any way when looking at that, like how do we determine that we're anthropomorphizing their behavior versus is it actually behavior that reflects a human-like attribute, I guess. No other motivation, just curiosity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, oftentimes, I have not spent a lot of time reading systematically studies in animal behavior. It's more spot reading. But I think for the most part, people do a really good job in the experimental design, right? As good of a job as you can. Studying animal behavior is complicated, right? And so to design good experiments with the right controls to draw conclusions is challenging, right? But so I think most of the results that you see are sound results. It's just that how are you then interpreting those results more as part of the meta-narrative? That's where the anthropomorphism becomes problematic, right? Does that make sense? Anybody else? Yes?
For the record, I have like a million questions, so if anyone has questions, just ask. Kind of going back to the Neanderthal and anatomical structure question, one of the things you pointed out was the differences in the brain, like size and shape. I'm just wondering, because this is something I thought about as well myself. So I'm doing my PhD in biology here, and so I obviously care a lot about the anatomical side. But the separation of mind and brain. So in other words, we have a lot of humans that have brain conditions where their brains aren't necessarily functioning the way a normal brain would, but they still seem to have plenty of capacity for mind. You can see a lot of like post-stroke patients and stuff like that. So I guess my question would be is how critical do you think the structure of the brain is to the capacity of having a mind? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and when I'm making that argument, and it's an argument that is also being made by anthropologists who study this. So I'm not out there on the island.
No.
Right. So, but what you're asking is a really important question, right? So to me, I see that as really reflecting average capabilities, right? That on average, you would not, given the brain structure, humans have overdeveloped parietal lobes, we have an overdeveloped temporal lobe. There's an interesting relationship between the size of the orbit and the amount of the brain that is devoted to interpreting vision, right? Or visual information based on primates. And so Neanderthals have a much larger eyesight. So the assumption is a larger proportion of the brain was devoted to interpreting visual information, which means that takes away from advanced cognitive abilities. Or their body mass presumably was greater than ours. Again, this is debatable, but which means more of their body was, or their brain was probably devoted to motor control. So all of this, says on average you would not expect Neanderthals to be like us. But I think the point you're making is a counter to that, right? But I see those as being exceptional, and probably it's evidence that at least in humans, there's probably an immaterial aspect to our nature, right? Not, but we don't know if that if there was a Neanderthal that had a poorly developed brain, what its behavior would be like. We don't know that, right? I mean, everything we are understanding about Neanderthal brains are largely an inference, right? Although there's some very interesting experiments being done, because when you compare the human and Neanderthal genomes, there's about 100 genes that are different. And the differences are usually amino acid here or there, right? And it turns out a number of those genes are playing a role in neurodevelopment, or they're implicated in neuropsychiatric disorders. And those genes seem to be regulated differently in humans and Neanderthals. It's kind of cool stuff because you can infer transcription factor binding sites, from the genomes, which is really kind of neat stuff. But people have created these brain organoids from human-induced pluripotent stem cells. You can actually go in and use CRISPR gene editing and Neanderthalize them systematically. And you wind up producing these brain organoids that are different than the human brain organoid in ways that suggest that there is a physiological impact of these genetic differences in a way that you would say Neanderthals may very well have been cognitively inferior, right? With the density and the quality of neurons, some people have argued were not as great in Neanderthals as in modern humans. Again, you're working on brain organoids using CRISPR gene editing, so you've got to interpret those results with caution, but at least it's suggesting those genetic differences may have physiological consequences. So to me, it all stacks up to say that Neanderthals weren't like us, right? And it's not meant to say that what they were doing wasn't remarkable. It's just that they weren't us, I guess, is my point. But yeah, your question is a great question. I think in the human context, that tells us that, my model is, and I get this model from a Christian neuroscientist named Matthew Stanford. I always think Matthew Stafford, he's the quarterback. But he wrote a great book that I actually recommend. It's called The Biology of Sin. And the point of the book is different than what I extracted from it. To me, is the insight. But he presents a model for the human being that involves a kind of a tripartite model, the brain, the mind, and the spirit. And you might think of maybe the spirit and the mind as a soul if you hold to a dichotomy view, but he presents a trichotomy. And he argues that the brain can be thought of like the hardware. It has to be intact. It has to function. It has certain capabilities that allow the image of God to be expressed. Right? So there's a physical aspect. We're not a ghost in the machine. We're an integration of a physical and immaterial selves. Right? We're integration. Right? So he argues that the brain can influence the mind, and the mind can influence the brain, and the spirit can influence the mind, and the mind can influence the spirit. So there's this interplay, right, between the three. But if there's something organically wrong with the brain, it could very well compromise the expression of the image of God. So in the book, he goes through a number of things that we would, as Christians, consider to be sinful, that because of people's organic brain chemistry can't help themselves. Like, if you have a certain allele for a particular neuroreceptor, you're much more prone to violent behavior, right? And people can't help themselves as part of this argument. And so it's really meant to not excuse the behavior, but to develop compassion for those people. But here's a situation where the organic structure of the brain is impacting the mental and the mind and the spirit of that person. But the hope is that also through a transformation of the spirit, you can influence the mind and maybe bring, the brain is highly plastic, right? So it's a very interesting model that I think is helpful, maybe helpful for your question, right? Because if there is an immaterial aspect, and there's part of the brain that's damaged, but that person still is functioning at a very high level mentally, that's a really strong argument that there's more than just our physical makeup. We're not just a brain.
Sorry.
A very quick follow to that, because this is something that gets brought up a lot, especially in kind of modern culture. I think the word you use there is a really good way to put it, with the expression of the mind. And I think I guess the implication when you think about like fetal development, or where life began, conception, or however we make that, people stand behind that argument. My argument is that your soul or your mind are given to you at conception, but it's just not actualized. You can't actualize it yet, and so, or express it yet. Instead of giving self-value. I guess my concern would be is if we focus too much on the brain being a particular way, well, what happens before you have a brain in your single self, right? Are you still human then, right?
Yeah, I mean, your view would be, your view and my view would be almost identical, right? So, and that is the danger of the argument that I present, is that it's very easy to think that really what defines the image of God is our brain structure, right? But I would argue that it's more than that. But if you're engaging in a scientific conversation, to even be able to say scientifically, there's something different about us, and that difference, that those qualities seem to be, reflected in anatomy and, the behavior and things like that, it strengthens the case. But I think but then you're in a position to begin to do the theology, right, and the philosophy. Yeah, so yeah, great points that you're bringing up.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have a question on what is your take on the transhumanist agenda? I'm thinking specifically things like Neuralink. How does that fit into the conversation we're having about what it means to be human?
Yeah, actually wrote a book called Humans 2.0, where I take a look at the whole idea of transhumanism, how to engage that from a Christian worldview perspective. So, and I've written several blog articles about Neuralink and brain-computer interfaces that are being developed. And the technology that's part of what Neuralink is trying to achieve has enormous, I think, enormous humanitarian use, particularly for people that are locked in, people that are quadriplegic, paraplegic, amputees. This is going to revolutionize how we treat them, right? But so these brain-computer interfaces, for people that are not aware, are essentially electronic devices that are implanted in the brain that allow the patient to control computer hardware and computer software, or machine hardware and computer software. And the more simple versions of BCIs involve the patient learning to control the output. More sophisticated versions are using machine learning to extract user intent from electrical patterns in the brain. And so this is incredible, because I would argue that those applications allow people to recover their lost humanity. If you're locked in and you can't communicate, to be able to communicate through text messages, through your thoughts, or to be able to compose music, right, is an incredible opportunity. Or if you have no mobility, to be able to learn to control exoskeletons to give yourself mobility, that type of thing is transformative. So I see that as a good thing. But with Neuralink, part of the agenda, there's other companies, so this isn't to point fingers at Elon Musk. Elon Musk and others who are developing BCI technology see it as the next generation of user interfaces for electronic devices. So instead of giving your phone a voice command, you just think, I just want my phone to, where's the nearest gas station? I just think it, right? That begins to, I think, encroach on our distinct human nature in a way that's troubling. To me, there's shades of gray, but interestingly enough, Elon Musk's ultimate motivation for Neuralink is he's afraid that as human beings we're going to be driven to extinction by AI technology. And so his argument is, unless we can actually interface our brains to computer systems and augment our intellectual capability, we're not going to be able to compete with AI. So he's become, in effect, I would say, a reluctant transhumanist. He's very different than other transhumanists who see really transhumanism as almost a religious system. He's more what I would call a reluctant transhumanist. But there's experiments that are being done where you can start tethering brains together, where people with BCIs in their brains, because of Bluetooth technology and the internet, you can literally tether brains together for people on opposite sides of the world, right? And so this is still a little bit, quite cutting edge, but these types of things are possible. And there's an experiment that I write about involving kind of BCI prototypes that were implanted in the brains of rats. And there was a rat that was trained to hit, activate a lever and get food. And there was another rat that wasn't trained to do that. And they both had BCIs, and they were in cages together. And the rat that wasn't trained to activate the lever had the contraption in his cage that he could potentially activate, but he didn't know what to do. And the rat on the other cage who knew what to do was observing this and was able to communicate through the BCI to the rat, and the rat knew to activate the lever. So there's really weird things going on that are going to raise some profound questions about the mind-brain, problem. And, that now really raises some deep concerns about, autonomy, identity, right? It's really quite, to me, quite frightening in terms of what we might do. I don't know that we could ever damage the image of God, right? Because I see that as part of our immaterial nature, but we could definitely damage the hardware that's needed to express the image of God.
Thank you.
Well, you guys are, as young men and women are walking into a really interesting world with AI developing, with transhumanism, gene editing, brain-computer interfaces. There's advances happening in anti-aging technology. Wow. You guys have your work cut out for you as people that hold, I would assume most of you here hold to a Christian worldview. You've got, sound like an old grandpa. You guys have got to really invest the effort in understanding this technology, and you've got to really invest the effort thinking about this from a Christian perspective, philosophically, theologically, and you've got to be able to engage our culture in a compelling way. I'm actually encouraged that a number of you have said that you're working in AI, you're learning about that. Right? I hope some of you become bioengineers and work on BCIs, because if Christians are not involved in this work, it's really, really frightening to think what will happen. And the power that you have as an embedded missionary in these fields is enormous, and it's an incredible calling. There's incredible good that you can do in these areas. So I really encourage you to pursue those areas and see that as part of your calling. But even if you don't, you know, it's not fun. It's a lot of hard work. This is hard stuff to wrap your mind around. But you've got to engage it. You know, and this is your responsibility for the church as we move into the future. You know, so.